Some of the injuries found on those bodies should not have been possible, not in a snowstorm, not on an open mountain, not without leaving a trace. In Part 2, search teams discovered that 9 experienced hikers had cut their way out of their own tent and fled into a -30-degree blizzard without their clothing, without their boots, and without any clear reason why. They didn't scatter. They moved together, down the slope, as if something had forced them out and given them no time to think. Some of them froze where they fell. Others tried to make it back. But 4 of them were found months later, buried deep in a ravine beneath the snow. And that's where this case stops being a mystery and becomes something else entirely. Because what was done to their bodies doesn't match anything investigators expected to find. The search party reached the tent, and what they found inside changed everything. The canvas had been slashed open from the inside. Warm clothing, boots, and food had all been left behind. 9 experienced mountaineers had fled into a -30-degree blizzard in their socks and underclothes, moving together down the slope in a loose, deliberate formation, rather than the scattered chaos of individual panic. At the cedar tree, the first 2 bodies were found, barefoot, underdressed, beside a fire too small to save them. 3 more were found on the open slope above, all appearing to have turned back toward the tent when they collapsed. And in a ravine buried under several meters of snow, the final 4 were discovered months later in May. Some wearing clothing stripped from those who had already died, in a last rational act of survival. The question of how they had died was, in some ways, already disturbing enough. But in Part 3, the question changes. It is no longer simply how. It is what. What kind of force could have done this? Thibaut Brignoles had suffered massive skull fractures, not the superficial crack found on Slobodin, but deep, catastrophic damage to the temporal bone, the kind of injury that the forensic examiner described as consistent with the force of a serious automobile collision. Yet there were no corresponding external wounds on his scalp, no lacerations, no bruising of the skin that would be expected if his skull had been struck or had struck a hard surface with that degree of violence. The internal devastation was present. The external evidence of how it had been caused was not. Dubinina and Zolotaryov both had bilateral rib fractures, multiple ribs broken on both sides of the chest, a pattern that the chief medical examiner compared explicitly to injuries seen in victims of vehicle collisions or significant explosive blasts. The force required to produce that pattern of damage was described as extraordinary, and yet, as with Thibaut Brignoles, neither showed the soft tissue damage, the bruising, the contusions, the lacerations that would normally accompany such severe internal injury if produced by a conventional physical blow. Something had transmitted enormous destructive force through their bodies without leaving the expected marks on their skin. Whatever it was, it had moved through flesh and bone like a pressure wave through water, devastating the interior while leaving the surface, largely bewilderingly, intact. And then there was what was missing from Lyudmila Dubinina's face. Her tongue was absent, gone from the root, in a manner that the forensic report described with careful clinical restraint that could not fully conceal the examiner's uncertainty. Her eyes were gone. The soft tissue of her lips had been substantially destroyed. The explanations offered at the time, decomposition, the action of meltwater, scavenger activity beneath the snowpack, were each considered and each found wanting in important ways. The body had been preserved by the cold for months. The tissue loss was selective in a manner inconsistent with uniform decomposition, which tends to proceed gradually and uniformly, rather than removing specific anatomical structures while leaving others intact. And Zolotaryov found beside her in conditions of near-identical preservation, did not exhibit comparable facial damage, which complicated any straightforward environmental explanation. What happened to her face has never been explained. It remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing and most unanswerable aspects of the entire case. It is the detail that researchers return to again and again, not because it is the most dramatic finding, but because it is the one that every proposed explanation quietly steps around, offering no real account of how it could have occurred. When clothing and equipment from the recovered bodies were subjected to radiological testing, investigators found something they had not anticipated. Several items, particularly clothing belonging to Krivonishenko and Dubinina, showed elevated levels of beta radiation, measurably above the background levels one would expect to find on the garments of mountaineers in that region. The readings were not dramatic enough to suggest acute radiation exposure, but they were consistent enough and specific enough in their distribution to be formally recorded in the investigation documents. Krivonishenko had worked at a closed Soviet nuclear facility before the expedition. It is possible he carried trace contamination on clothing brought from his workplace. Atmospheric fallout from nuclear tests conducted across remote Soviet territory during this period was widespread, and residual contamination could have settled on outer garments over days of travel. These are plausible explanations. They are also, on careful examination, incomplete ones, particularly given that the radiation appeared concentrated on specific garments, rather than distributed uniformly across all recovered clothing, which is not what one would expect from either ambient fallout or simple workplace contamination carried passively on fabric. The formal Soviet investigation concluded in May of 1959. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, closed the case with a conclusion phrased in language that has since become one of the most analyzed and debated passages in the history of this case. The group, he wrote, had perished as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. No criminal proceedings were opened. The case files were classified and placed in a restricted archive, where they would remain inaccessible for more than 30 years. The Kholat Syakhl area was closed to hikers for the following 3 years, a measure that served no obvious purpose if the deaths had simply been the result of a natural force, and a measure that suggests, at minimum, that someone in the Soviet bureaucratic apparatus believed there was something on or near that mountain that the public should not investigate. When Ivanov himself, in an interview conducted late in his life after the Soviet Union had dissolved and the files had been partially declassified, was asked what he personally believed had caused the deaths, he said that in his view the incident was connected to military activity, and that pressure from officials whose names he declined to provide had compelled him to close the investigation before its true dimensions could be established. Whether that testimony represents the truth of a troubled conscience or the retrospective reframing of a man seeking to reposition his own role in a troubling episode is impossible to determine with certainty. But it is a statement made by the man who ran the original inquiry, and it carries a weight that does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. The lead investigator of the Dyatlov Pass case spent his final years saying, quietly and without dramatics, that the conclusion he had signed his name to was not the truth. That is where the official record ends, and where the hardest questions begin. In Part 4, the final chapter, we examine every major theory that has been proposed to explain this case, and we take each one apart. The avalanche, the infrasound, the military testing hypothesis. We look at what each one explains, and more importantly, what each one cannot explain. And we examine the 2019 Russian government reinvestigation, the official attempt 60 years later to close the case for good, and why its conclusion left almost no one satisfied. Part 4 is where this story reaches its end, and its end is not an answer. It is a silence. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a story. It's a mystery that refuses to let go. 9 experienced hikers, a single night, and questions that, even after decades, still don't have answers. If you found this story as unsettling and fascinating as it truly is, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you might think, and it lets me know you want part 4, because we're almost there, and the final part is the one that will stay with you. Part 4 will be out shortly. Follow for more true crime and unexplained mysteries.